Good morning, everybody. I wanted to show you the completed journal that I created. In my mind, this one was a seamstress journal, so it's patterns and fabric samples that she collected and put together in a book so that she had kind of a reference for her things. So that kind of explains why I put it together the way I did. So just tied with a simple seam binding, which she probably had plenty of, right? And the cover is a copy from a 1940s Simplicity catalog. I added some vintage trims and some vintage mother of pearl buttons and some additional vintage fabric. I love this beautiful fabric that I put it on, and I thought that it went really nicely with the colors in the dresses. So inside, I'm still figuring this out, people. You'd think by now I'd get the camera right, but I'm not so great with it. I added the rest of this fabric swatch I added here. Just a beautiful vintage fabric. I love the colors in it. Kind of shabby chic looking. I added some safety pins, some straight pins that were in a vintage sewing box. Also some vintage needles, and just tuck those in there. And a copy from a newspaper. So a lot of the inserts in here I just put on regular copy paper and coffee dyed them because I was thinking it looks like she was, you know, collecting things from magazines, etc., and putting them in her reference book. So that was the thinking behind that. And the pocket here I created just from a vintage dish towel. So it really is made out of toweling and has this pretty crochet border on it. And I was going to embellish it, but I thought it was pretty the way it was. So I just added the safety pins, made it look like a little workbook for her. These pages are all coffee dyed. Some are echo dyed by my friend Colleen. She's always experimenting with echo dye, and I'm lucky enough to be the beneficiary of her practice. So thank you again, Colleen. This lady is from a vintage pattern. So I had some patterns that I was able to purchase from a Facebook seller, and I copied them and fussy cut the ladies and applied them to the back of the pattern envelopes. The envelopes were all really tattered, so in some cases I've actually used the actual envelopes after scanning them. So I sewed around the edges on this pocket, and there's nothing in it, but I made a pocket to tuck fabric samples or whatever, and put a few pieces of vintage fabric here as samples for the dress, including this with the delightful little border that I was envisioning she would use for her neck piece here. And then coffee dyed. My coffee dyed pages are from GT Designs. Love her papers. Thank you, Renee. This lady, I just love this pattern. I really fell in love with it, and so I wanted to do something special with this dress. So I had this, I believe it may be avocado dyed. I think I got this from Colleen as well. It's either from Colleen or Renee. But I applied it to her dress, and I applied some very sheer fabric to her sleeves. And this was actually a border from this piece, so I just applied it to make a belt and the border on the bottom of her dress, and applied it to the actual back of the pattern for this dress. I like the way it came out. This is actually from the fold from the way the pattern originally was. So, I sewed this one to the actual book because I figure, well, it's a seamstress and that's probably what she would do, right? So more beautiful papers. I just get lost in these papers personally. This is more of the paper from the front, and I just folded it over to make a very simple pocket where she could stash some more magazine pages. This cool sample page, I don't know how well you can see this dress, but I'm sorry, the coat, but look at the back of that coat, the way it's detailed. Very cool pieces from vintage. This is from a vintage sample card, and this another one from the Simplicity book, I think. Kind of lost track. You can see that I carried the fabric all the way through the book here. I like the peak of it there. Another vintage pattern. This beautiful dress. The 30s are my favorite, so I try to stick with somewhere in that era. And same with the fabrics. They may not all be authentic to the right era, but they seem to go well together. And this also is a pocket, so another place to stash things. And I added some vintage buttons and pieces of vintage laces that, you know, samples of what she might use if she was creating a dress with these buttons and these laces, etc. Had fun with that one because I really enjoyed those fabrics. Let's see what else we got in here. This one, actually what I did is I copied the actual pattern envelope and I folded it the way the actual envelope was folded. So I basically recreated the envelope, but then I cut out the lady on the front and made her into a little embellishment here. So this is just sewn right into the book as an envelope. And a little piece of vintage fabric that I'm imagining would be beautiful on this dress. And on the other side is the front of that envelope. Let's see. A piece of vintage skirt ruffle that was also coffee dyed. And just a bunch of different pieces of copies from old patterns, copies from a newspaper, I'm assuming, I'm sure it's from a newspaper, a card for different threads, just all things that in my mind she would have collected and stashed away so that she could have reference to them at some point. Kind of like the way the colors look in there. More peekaboo there. All these great papers. And then I even have a gentleman in his bathrobe. Love the bathrobe pattern. This is another pattern I think I got on a Facebook. I like that there's some writing on it. I like that it was tattered, so I stayed with the tatteredness of it and as I created it into a pocket, and then I tucked another gentleman off the same pattern that I fussy cut him and glued him to a book page from an old sewing book. So just tucked him in there and tucked some samples here that I just paper clipped on, but these are just different pieces of thicker fabrics that might be used to make the bathrobes. Some more great papers. Okay, we got pajamas here. So we had the bathrobe and now we got the ladies' PJs and a couple vintage fabrics to use to make these delightful PJs and some vintage buttons that I thought went nicely. Just kind of made it fun. And then these are, both ladies are from the same pattern. So I did the same thing. The ladies were on the front and I glued this lady to the back of the pattern. It was an advanced pattern, and added another piece of vintage fabric for her PJs. So wouldn't those be fun? I would love that. I thank you, Michelle Franchino, for all the cool fabric scraps that you sent me. They've gone a long way, and I'm enjoying using them. No scrap is too small to reuse. That's what I say. So here's a sample card I made with fabric scraps and some scraps of lace and this great stamp that I just got in the mail that I found on Etsy. So I know that I'm going to get a lot of use out of this one. I just had this idea that I wanted to make more sample cards, so I looked for a stamp, and this is a vintage stamp. Pretty old one, I think, and I just added all these little fabrics, and I put a piece of copy from a pattern on the back and just kind of sewed them on and made them into a sample card and tucked them behind this lady from this pattern, and I just again glued her to the copy of her pattern. And then at the end, this little piece of vintage eyelet lace. It's beautiful, isn't it? And it's stitched over here. So I thought, you know, she's displaying some of her stitching. And so I just pinned it here. And it was appropriate because we've got some newspaper pieces about different accessories, a bow for the collar, belt, facing the V neckline. So I thought that those looked really nice in there with that and set it off really nicely. And simple and sweet, and I had a lot of fun making this one. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.